What do you have to lose right now? I just think people are scared to fail.
Being able to understand what it means to have to wait, to be patient.
You're listening to the Yash and Company podcast.
Hey everyone, this is Yash, and you are most definitely listening to another episode of the Yash and Company podcast. This is a show where we learn from the world's best 20 and 30-year-olds, whether it's someone on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list or someone that is a professional athlete, or as we have on today's episode, one of the world's best researchers on the ketogenic diet, Mr. Ryan Lowery himself. And as we always do, here's a short intro about our guest, Dr. Ryan Lowery. Dr. Ryan P. Lowery is a 2014 national championship baseball player who earned his BS and MS in exercise physiology and exercise and nutritional science from the University of Tampa. Ryan completed his doctorate work at Concordia University in health and human performance with a focus on the effects of a well-formulated ketogenic diet and exogenous ketone supplementation on various markers of health and body composition in healthy and diseased populations. Ryan currently serves as a CEO of Ketogenic.com and the president of the Applied Science and Performance Institute. Over his career, Ryan has published over 150 papers, abstracts, and book chapters on human performance and sports nutrition, and is heavily focused on the impact of ketogenic diets and exogenous ketones on performance, cognitive function, and longevity. Ryan has received the Exercise Science Scholar of the Year Award, the NSCA Award for Outstanding Presentation of the Year, and the National AAHPERD Exercise Science Major of the Year Award. Ryan recently co-authored the book, The Ketogenic Bible, alongside his partner, Dr. Jacob Wilson, which focuses on the science and practical application behind the ketogenic diet, exogenous ketones, and all of their potential applications. So this episode is actually something I consider breaking up because there is actually two very distinct halves to this episode. So on the first half we dive into keto. So Dr. Ryan Lowery, who's probably one of the top 3 or 4 or 5 researchers in the field, really dives into what is keto, why the average person needs keto, and whether you're someone that has heard about keto, maybe you live the keto lifestyle like me, or maybe you just don't believe in it at all. I think this is definitely worth listening to. So many of y'all know that I myself have been in keto for the past 5 or 6 months. This is something that I've went on after I'm trying to actually help my dad out. He's actually pre-diabetic, and as I was helping him in his journey, I've learned so much and became actually a huge fan of keto. So there's so much to look forward to. We debunk a ton of different myths. We talk into some really fun topics, including biohacking. We talk about the microbiome. We talk about cognitive benefits of keto, even discuss a little bit about cancer too. So really fun first half. And then on the second half of the episode, we get into the weeds about Dr. Ryan Lowery himself. So Ryan is a jack of all trades. He owns multiple businesses, and we dive into how he is able to stay in the zone, how he's able to balance everything that he has in his lifestyle, and all that he's learned from some of the best that he works with, namely Tony Robbins himself. So there's so much to dive into in this episode and so much to take up. So without further ado, here is a long form conversation with Dr. Ryan P. Lowery. Hey everyone, this is Yash. I'm in Waco, Texas, recording this episode with the Dr. Ryan Lowery. And Ryan, I believe you're joining us from your home base of Tampa, right?
Absolutely, man. Yeah, I'm honored to be on.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be doing this, and one of the reasons is because when I actually started this podcast, I had a list of people that I wanted to have on the show, and at one point it'd be great to talk to, and you were on that list, and so here we are. So from my perspective, the podcast is doing pretty well now.
Oh man, I love it, man. It's a great way to get information out, and I appreciate the opportunity to jump on and talk with you.
So maybe we can just kind of start with your story. So you go to the University of Tampa for undergrad, right? And you're actually a baseball player, a national champion baseball player. And where did keto come in the middle of all this for you?
Yeah, so I went to University of Tampa. I met Dr. Jacob Wilson, who's was a great mentor of mine and now business partner. But we were just doing research. Like he kind of introduced me to the research world, and we were doing research on everything from just regular nutritional protocols to exercise. We're doing things like blood flow restriction training, all these different cool studies that I was interested in. And then it was about my sophomore year of college when we went to a conference, and it was a National Strength and Conditioning Association conference, and Dr. Jeff Volek was giving a presentation on ketogenic diet and endurance athletes. And at the end of the presentation, someone stood up and they were like, "Hey, but Dr. Volek, what research is there on like resistance training athletes?" And he goes, "We literally don't have any. Like there's nothing really out there." And so Jacob and I looked at each other. We're like, "Man, this is our realm. I've heard about keto before, but like no one's studied this. This is what I want to go into, and this is what I want to look into more." And that just led down the rabbit hole of doing all different types of research. We were the first ones really to do research showing that you could really gain muscle on a ketogenic diet. And that kind of just fed forward everything else that we started looking at, everything from longevity, and now everything we're looking into with neurological conditions. And now it's just, I'm deep into the rabbit hole and I love every second of it.
Yeah, it's definitely the past, it seems like the past 5 years have been crazy for you. So, I definitely want to get to all of that. So, you mentioned Dr. Jacob Wilson. For those that might not have heard of him, I think you maybe have heard of him being referred to as the muscle PhD. But yeah, check him out. He has some really cool stuff going on. So Ryan, when we talk about keto, I think there's a lot of different ways that this could be described. So how would you describe keto in your own words for someone that maybe has never heard of it?
Yeah, so basic, like very, very basic. Most people understand, oh, it's a low carb, high fat, moderate protein sort of approach. But in essence, what it is, it's a metabolic state. There's a ton of different ways to get into a state of ketosis. You can get in through fasting, you can get in through extreme calorie restricting, but probably the most sustainable and the one that like you and I do is more like a well-formulated ketogenic diet where you're eating things that tend to be higher in fat, very, very low in carbohydrates and protein, things like avocados and like certain steaks or things like that, like all of these foods that are higher fat, lower carb, and moderate to higher protein.
Sure. And so this is going to be a hard question, but for someone, again, that might not know a whole lot about keto, why should someone even venture into keto? What is the advantage of keto?
Yeah, and I think most of our society, at some level, most people they claim they want to lose weight. That's not true. They want to lose fat. People confuse the concept of weight with actual body composition. People want to lose fat. No one wants to lose muscle. So people want to lose fat, and the majority of our population is insulin resistant. If you look at the staggering data, and the results show that most people are, if you're not diabetic, most people are pre-diabetic or heading towards that route. And so the question is, if your body is resistant to utilizing carbohydrates or glucose as a fuel source, which is insulin resistance, your body isn't taking up that fuel source as well anymore, why would we still continue to pound the door and try and knock glucose or carbohydrates in when your body's resistant to it? What if you were able to provide an alternative source of fuel? And that's what you're able to do with a well-formulated ketogenic diet, and lowering things like glucose and insulin and improving that. You'll see dramatic, and you see this all over the keto community, incredible transformations and fat loss.
Sure. And I'm so glad you mentioned that no one actually wants to lose muscle. They only want to lose fat, because in reality, that's the only thing we're talking about, right? When it comes to diets, like that's why you want to do something different. But when I think of people, I kind of think in their health condition, I kind of group people into three different categories. You might have like group one, where you're overweight and you're trying to cut down on the fat, or maybe you're group two, where you're moderately healthy and you're just looking to kind of maintain, maybe lose a little bit of fat, but you're pretty good for right now. And then group three, you're really trying to put on some weight. And by put on weight, you're definitely trying to put on muscle, right? So why would people within those three groups want to be in keto?
Yeah, well, I love that. I love those three groups. I 100% agree. The first one is like we just talked about. Those tend to be the people who are insulin resistant. Those are the people who have probably yo-yo dieted and tried everything underneath the book. And in essence, one of the things I want to bring up is that population, group 1, the overweight, obese individuals, food is in control. A lot of these people have a ridiculous appetite. The one thing that gets me upset is some people go, well, oh, it's easy, like just put down the fork. That's not the case. Like their appetite, people who are overweight or obese tend to have a greater appetite. They're hungry even when they just ate 1,000 calories. And so how do you do that? One of the things that we like, being in a state of ketosis, I like to say, puts appetite back in your control. So these people aren't eating as much. They're fasting when they really could have never gone 2 hours without snacking on something, and they're seeing incredible results. So I really feel like beyond what I talked about with the insulin sensitivity, the fact that appetite is now back in their control, that's a huge, huge win for group 1. Group 2, those are people who are looking for probably a lot of the same things. Like those people might be more insulin sensitive, slightly more insulin sensitive than group 1. But in essence, they're looking to maintain lean muscle, and they still want to make sure they're losing some fat, maybe not a great deal of it. But ultimately their goal is like, hey, how do I lower inflammation if I'm working out? They're probably more looking forward to like the longevity aspect. Well, there's tons of data that we can dive into in that regard of like, hey, how do I make this a lifestyle? How do I make this something that I'm less inflamed? I don't have any of these typical complications that people my age or whatever tend to have. And then the last one, I mean, at the end of the day, you hit the nail on the head. People are looking to gain muscle. Like I was one of those people, and I'll rightfully admit it. In college, when I was playing baseball, I was 160 pounds. And my coach used to get on me all the time. He used to be like, I need you at 180. I need you at 180. And I was the guy who was slugging down weight gainer shakes like crazy. I would have 2 a day, and each gainer shake had 1,500 calories in it itself. So I was having probably 700 to 800 grams of carbs per day, but I was so insulin sensitive. I was so active. That probably led to it. Things have since changed since I stopped playing sports, but those are the people who are trying to you want to put on quality mass. And I was doing it the wrong way. Like, you don't need to slug down all these weight gainer shakes. You do need to be in a caloric surplus, but there's a better way to do that. And in essence, you want to make sure you're putting in on the quality mass rather than I can get someone to gain 10 pounds very, very quickly if they just eat a bunch of junk, but that's not the quality type of mass or the body composition that we're looking for.
So a lot of the research that you mentioned is actually research that you've done, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, us and or collaborated with some of our colleagues.
Yeah, and I'll definitely link that in the show notes for anyone that wants to check it out. But, Ryan, whenever I mentioned to someone that, yeah, you can actually gain weight on keto, it's just so hard for them to get that in their head. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, you can certainly gain weight. And this is what I tell people this all the time. I'm like, listen, if you stick like a full stick of butter inside of your coffee and then go and eat a buffet breakfast, and it doesn't matter if you're keto, like if you're eating 6,000 to 7,000 calories per day, you're going to gain weight. And likely you probably will gain some fat mass along with that. Like it's not, I hate to use this term, it's not bulletproof itself. It's like the diet. Like if you're having an excessive amount of calories, of course you're going to be like, it's not just magic. However, the goal is a lot of people tend to not eat as much, period. Like they're fuller, they're more satiated. They tend to not eat the same junk that they used to eat, and they're realizing they're eating a ton less. And so it is possible to put on weight. Now, it is also possible to put on quality mass. For those individuals, they're probably like you look at some of the people that are in the keto community, like Danny Vega or some of these other people that are monsters, they're putting on muscle. How are they doing that? They're probably having a little bit higher amounts of protein, and they're bumping up their protein a little bit higher than someone who might be on just a traditional ketogenic diet, and they're training really, really hard. At the end of the day, if you want to put on muscle, you have to train hard, and you need to fuel your body with whatever it needs to recover. On a ketogenic diet, that's going to be making sure you're getting in ample amounts of fats and proteins that are of high quality nature.
I think sometimes when we think of diets, sometimes people make it seem like this diet is going to work for everyone, right? Paleo's for everyone. Being vegan, that's going to work for everyone. But in reality, it might not be the best for certain types of people. So what populations of people do you think that keto is something that you wouldn't recommend?
For people that are, and this is a great question because I very rarely get asked this question, so I'm glad you brought it up. People who are extremely insulin sensitive and they don't have a worry about inflammation, they're not worried about like any neurological condition. If you are one of those people, and this is a small percentage, but if you're one of those people who can literally eat an entire box of donuts and you wake up the next morning and you're leaner, first off, that's good for you. But second, like, it might not be that, like, switching to a keto. Why would you? Like, there's no absolute need to like say, hey, I'm going to switch to a ketogenic diet. If your cells in your body and you have incredible genetics to be able to go, hey, my cells readily take up glucose and carbohydrates, I'm fueling on that, or like I am some high intensity athlete and I do completely fine on carbohydrates and I'm not worried about things like traumatic brain injury or any other inflammatory markers, then by all means, for sure, go ahead, enjoy. I still wouldn't recommend eating 12 donuts a day, but like go ahead and have some carbohydrates. Like that's completely fine. But that population is few and far between.
Sure. So for someone like you, what does a keto look like, right? So you're someone who obviously cares about this stuff. You care about your body. You're probably not working out 7 days a week, but you are maintaining, you are trying to be physically fit. So what does keto look like for you on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I try to work out at least 5 days a week. But as far as eating, I tend to do intermittent fasting primarily on the weekdays. So I do probably 2 meals a day, Monday through Friday. And that basically looks like typically like I'm a big fan of Cobb salads. I have Cobb salads typically for lunch or some type of salad with meat and avocados. And then for dinner, it's usually just some meat and sometimes I'll do vegetables depending upon if I'm doing an experiment on myself or not. But it's typically just a meat and a vegetable and sometimes just like a side salad. But it's very simple. I like keep things simple. But and then on the weekends, I tend to do 3 meals, and mainly because one, I always enjoy breakfast foods. I did growing up, and like for me, I look at that as like a time to do it because I'm going to be more active. I'm not sitting in an office all day. I'm probably out taking my dog to the dog park or like running around going hiking with friends or something. So on those days, I tend to have probably 3 meals. And I always wake up and make like nice keto pancakes or keto waffles. But that's the biggest thing. It's just being able to always, I like to say, ketofy a lot of these recipes and make things that I used to love growing up. And now I love them even more because they're not a metabolic disaster. They're actually good for my body to have. And they taste delicious.
Yeah, it's almost like a cheat weekend, but a little bit on the healthier end. So when you're talking about the food that you eat on the weekdays, someone might look at that and say, well, that does not sound filling at all for me. But and tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're probably adding oil to your salad, right? Some kind of dressing that's very that's like avocado or olive oil based, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. And that's a very good point. And so I'm one of those people, trust me, if you're like, there's no way I'd be hungry, like you're talking to the king of it. I'm the guy who like goes to a buffet and makes sure that I'm eating for everyone that I'm sitting with because I love eating. Like food was always a big thing. I grew up, my mom, my grandmother cooked for an army. And so I was used to like, and my dad was in the military. So he was always like, don't like make sure there's nothing left on your plate. So I was used to just eating so much or trying to eat so much. So I'm a perfect example of that. And so for me, not only being in a state of ketosis helps suppress your appetite, but also it's one of the reasons like I talk about why I love Cobb salads. It's volume. And a lot of times people don't understand that. Like you can eat you can eat 5,000 calories worth of Pop-Tarts very easily and be like, cool, or like 5,000 calories worth of Swedish fish and candy, because there's not much volume. But try and eat 5,000 calories worth of Cobb salads. It's a lot more difficult because it's so much volume, meaning that it's taking up a lot of space. And when you put that inside of your body and you have it inside of your stomach's like a balloon. Like if you fill it up, the more you fill it up with things like water, vegetables, like some of these things that are inside of a Cobb salad, like the more you fill that up, the more satiated you're going to be. Whereas I could eat a ton of Swedish fish and it would take a long time for those Swedish fish to increase or fill up the balloon inside of my stomach.
Yeah, no, I love that. So whenever I have people over, I always have them over for brunch, and I very similar to you. I'll intermittent fast, and the first meal of the day for me is a omelet with peppers and all kinds of other vegetables. I like mine a little spicier, and then I'll do a salad on the side. It's kind of an odd brunch, but whenever I have someone over, I ask them, "Hey, do you want some salad?" And they'll say yes, and I'll make it for them. And once they finish eating, they say, "Wow, I am so full." And so I say that I basically have eaten probably the same thing as you. Except the only difference is that I probably added a few other extra tablespoons of olive oil or avocado oil, and that right there, I've added probably another 300, 400 calories, and I probably had 1,000 calories in that meal, and that's going to keep me going till dinner. So I think it's one of those things that I think at the end of the day, it's one of those things you have to try, and you can't there's so much noise that happens around, or people can be blinded by. And at the end of the day, you just have to try it out for yourself and see if it's working. And one of the things you mentioned earlier was experimenting on yourself. And I love that because, so I want to know, what does experimenting on yourself look like? For me, I have a ketone monitor. I actually prick myself and check my blood ketone levels. And it's funny because my nemesis is almond butter. There's a difference between the days that I don't eat almond butter and the days that I do. And I'm like, wow, I can't believe I got kicked out of keto because of this. Obviously I don't know for 100% for 100% certainty if that's what it is, but that's kind of just what I'm predicting. But is that similar to what it looks like for you, or?
No, that's very cool. No, I'm the same way, but yeah, I don't test as much as I used to. I used to test foods all the time, like this. But for me, experimenting now is I'm fortunate to have access to our lab and a lot of different things. So for instance, I just did a month-long carnivore experiment and was able to look at so many different markers. So I did everything from body composition to metabolism to any blood marker you can think of. I did my microbiome. I did my deuterium levels. I just did a whole bunch of different testing, and I just like to see it because I get asked all these questions similar to you. Is getting asked all these questions. I'm like, honestly, there's no research right now on this stuff. So I'm going to go through it, and I can't give you an answer until I test it on myself and then let you know what I find out.
Sure. So when you say the microbiome, this is something that I'm really fascinated by. And the first person we had on the podcast, his name was Travis Whitfield, and he was on Forbes 30 Under 30. And the company that he started was, using the microbiome. And they're using it for dermatology, but it really got me fascinated about the microbiome because there's so much going on in the space. And from at a micro level, that is kind of one of the pros of keto, right? Is you actually do get to just get your gut bacteria to be almost to where it was supposed to be. And it helps helps that bacteria flourish. But so what is, when you check your microbiome, what does that entail?
It's a lot of it, depending upon which service you're using. The process of it can be pretty interesting. I don't think a lot of people would do, sometimes it involves literally collecting your entire stool and sending it in. And then they analyze it, and the results sometimes are just overwhelming, and you have to be able to dissect it. And it basically, like you said, it's telling you your different bacteria that are flourishing inside of your gut, and looking at different changes, how they're reacting, how they're dealing with certain things. There's a couple different ones out there now, and they all use different testing measures. Some of them are just a swab. Some of them are full collection. But it'll be interesting to compare. I did a month of carnivore where basically I was eating no fiber, no added fiber from vegetables or anything. I'm off of that now for sure, just because I missed my Cobb salads and the volume of foods. But
Sure.
it's a big question. It's a big question that people always bring up, and I want to look at it. So I'm actually still waiting on the results of some of my microbiome tests.
Sure. So are there any microbiome testing companies that you would recommend or services that you've used?
The one I'd say for mass market, I think Ubiome is one of the best that's out there, solely because theirs is a lot less invasive. Like you literally take a swab of the toilet paper, whereas I also did Biome, and Biome you literally have to like set up this collection thing underneath your toilet. You need to collect it. You need to like scoop it into this thing. And I was just thinking in my mind, I'm like, there's no way my mom would do this. Like my mom, like I could probably get her to swab toilet paper, but there's no way she's going to like, there's no. So for most people, that's probably a better option.
Yeah, so I actually I have one of these services that I actually ordered too, and it's just sitting there, and I haven't like actually like done the test, but I'm glad I'm not the only one that's like self-experimenting all these crazy things. So yeah, no, I mean I mentioned this to you before, but in reality, the reason I do all this and the reason I'm so fascinated by this and very similar to you is, when you go to a doctor and you say, "Hey, I want to try keto," or hey, I want to know what's good for me. In reality, they can tell you all these generalities, but they won't know what specifically is going to work for you. Because first of all, everybody's different. And second of all, the truth is most doctors don't really know much about keto. They've probably studied metabolism and nutrition, probably probably first year medical school or something. And, they just don't get around to actually understanding the nuances of it. And so, and then they hear all these things. And so they're kind of like everyone else out there too. They just really don't know much about the science and the papers that are being published. And so, yeah, so I guess just like you, it's just something that I'm super fascinated by, and something that it got started by just my dad asking some questions. But yeah, here we are. So it's just kind of interesting to see the progression from just a few months ago to now.
No, I love that you mentioned that, and I love that you bring that up because it is just a lack of knowledge. That's why I love everything you're doing with the podcast. I love getting information out. Because that's what's needed, right? If you think about it, and people get frustrated about it, they're like, "Oh, the doctors are out to get us," and I'm like, "There's certainly probably some bad apples in the bunch, but in essence, like think about this: I'd rather my doctor be more concerned about if I have, God forbid, some injury or some surgery that needs to happen, and or some sickness that he needs to get into. I'd rather him be focused on that than worrying about dietary advice. But it's just unfortunate because most people go to their doctors and that's where they get their dietary advice from. And they don't know. They're not digging into the research. They're not on Google Scholar or PubMed like you or I, like pretty much weekly looking into some of these things. They just don't have the time. That's not a priority for them to focus on that. And so they're focusing on different items. And it's like, cool. Well, that's why you need to go through trusted authorities like yourself and people that are on your podcast. Like that's what people hopefully should go towards, and then find someone that's a right fit for them.
Sure. I think that's great advice. So let's talk about some myths when people think about keto. The one that I hear all the time is, okay, your body's producing ketones when you're in ketosis. And for those that might not have a science background, so you actually produce ketones, and it's really popular because or this term ketones are popular because diabetics produce ketones when they have really high insulin sensitivity, and it's actually a very deadly state. And so whenever I told my pre-med friends, yeah, like I'm doing ketosis and I've tracked my ketones levels, and yeah, my ketone levels are up high and I'm super excited. They get so worried. They're saying, why are your ketones level high? Oh my gosh, are you okay? And so I'll let you take this one. So why is it that people that are in keto, they should not worry about their ketone levels spiking up all the way to the point where it's like someone that's in diabetic ketoacidosis?
Yeah, and I think that gets confused a lot. Like people hear the word keto or ketosis or ketogenic, and all of a sudden they think diabetic ketoacidosis. And those are two very, very different metabolic states. So, like you said, being on a ketogenic diet, being in a state of ketosis, like to put it in perspective, your range for blood ketone levels might go from zero point 0.3 to like at the highest, if you're supplementing with like ketone esters on top of being on a ketogenic diet, you might see like a 4 or 5. Diabetic ketoacidosis starts at about 15 millimoles. And that's really where it starts to go. And it's basically, it only happens in uncontrolled, typically type 1 diabetics, where they have a ridiculously high amount of ketones, like I said, 15 millimoles, and a ridiculously high glucose level. So they're having both, and that's, like you said, that's when it becomes very, very dangerous and very deadly. But again, it's in type 1, uncontrolled type 1 diabetics is where you typically see that.
Yeah, and I'm actually a big fan of fasting, and I'm looking forward to doing like a 2 to 3 day fast at one point. Just mainly out of I think it's just a very humbling experience, but also just to see what it's like, and also to do a little self-experimentation on it, and just to see what the ketones levels, how high they would go. And you're right, I've heard people say most you'll probably see it as 3, 4, if you're lucky, maybe 5, but that's like crazy high. And so I think that's a really good point. So another thing that I hear from my friends when they ever mention ketosis is that they kind of just conceptualize this idea that so if you're fasting, your body produces ketones because you go through all your glucose and then you start producing the ketones are the source that your body will start producing and for fuel. And so one thing that they'll say is, this is almost like a backup state. So, if in the olden days, if we were, in a famine, then the ketones are there and they're going to help you out. But, why should someone in today's world where we have abundance of food available to us, why should we pursue this when, we could just have, reduce our carbs a little bit, maybe not even go into ketosis, but just, live a quote unquote healthy lifestyle that's maybe moderate fat, moderate carbs, pretty decent amount of protein. What's your kind of argument against that?
Yeah, well, a couple things. One, I'd argue that being in a ketogenic state was our primary fuel source. It wasn't secondary, because we probably fasted more than we feasted. And so what did we feast on? We feasted on literally animals, like maybe some fruits and berries, but like in essence, we're probably in a ketogenic state at most of the point. It wasn't until highly processed, and now what we have, which is crazy, called ultra processed foods, started coming into our society, did we really get rid of that, like completely rid ourselves of this metabolic state of being in ketosis. And for most people, like, it's like, oh, why don't I just be moderate, like all around? Why don't I just be like 30, 33, 33, 33, fats, proteins, carbs? Well, if you look at it, that's a typical American diet. Like, you look at a fast food diet, it's probably 33, 33, 33. And like, if you look at the composition of Big Macs, or you look at compositions of some of these foods, like they're pretty high in carbs. They're also pretty high in fats, and they probably have some protein in them if you're having like a burger. So that's probably what plagues us. I think sitting on the fence is the challenge, because when you have a high amount of carbohydrates, like when insulin is high and you're triggering insulin to be high, you shut off a process known as lipolysis, which is basically the breakdown of fat. So then introducing a high amount of fat on top of that probably isn't a good idea. And that's probably what's plagued our society for the last several decades, is that we were having, we're having high fat diets. Well, no, they were high fat, high carbohydrate diets. And the reason is, when you have that insulin spike, you're not really having any lipolysis. So what happens then? You store it. You store that fat, and ultimately you get the result or the consequences of a lot of what we're facing today.
So there's a couple things that I think we missed out on as we're talking about keto. And one of those things is just the cognitive abilities that you get with the benefits of cognitively that you get with ketosis. This is one of the real reasons that I did keto. But Ryan, could you kind of talk about why that happens, and have you kind of had your experience with that?
Yeah, so in essence, like I said, we refer to like it ketones that are produced as like a fourth macronutrient. And as we get older, as we get more insulin resistant, our brain also becomes insulin resistant. So a lot of times people just think, oh, body composition, but your brain isn't able to take up and utilize that fuel source. We're referring to Alzheimer's today as type 3 diabetes. And that's because the brain isn't able to take up and utilize the fuel source that we're normally giving it. And so we start to see these tau plaques and all these things start to build up, forgetting where keys are, all of those things. And so what if ketones could provide an alternative fuel source? What if they could really provide that cognitive energy, that focus that you're looking for, solely because you're providing a fuel source that the brain can actually utilize? And it can. It's been shown over and over again that a large majority, a large percentage of the brain can take up and perfectly run fine on ketones by itself. So that's the interesting piece. We're starting to see more and more data in a lot of these neurological conditions, everything from Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's. We're doing research on all three of those areas because they all really stem in large part to a similar feature, which is your brain can't take up and utilize carbohydrates. Your brain can't take up and utilize glucose the same way that it used to. So we need to provide an alternative source of fuel. We need to fix that. We need to, instead of just saying, oh, we're going to pound down the door. We use this analogy in our book. Instead of saying, you know what, it's resistant. Imagine a door being locked. Well, if I pound on it hard enough, eventually it'll open. And that's what people are doing when they're shoving a ton of carbohydrates and then injecting themselves with insulin to pound down that door. Rather than try and do that, why don't I fix the root of the problem? Why don't I fix and try and go, well, there's no reason to try and pound and beat down the door. What if I just provide a different avenue? What if I just open up the window and jump in through that? Because I can get inside still, and that's through ketones.
Yeah, I couldn't help but as you were talking about all these things, think about my biochem class. We were talking about like cancer and all these things that glucose causes. And I think someone that maybe doesn't have a background in this might not understand, but I remember, so I take biochem 2 this semester just because, again, I'm just such a nerd. And I wanted to really understand the science of keto. And it's so fascinating to me because, you're learning about, one of the things we learned about was the insulin pathway and, what all the markers are and how that works. And it's also funny to me that all the markers that we're actually inhibiting for cancer therapy are in that same pathway, right? In that insulin uptake. And so it's just so fascinating that, you look at all this and say, you use common sense and say that, well, that a lot of that process is stimulated by glucose and it's stimulated by your sensitivity to insulin. So why even put yourself at risk in the first place? But I guess that's a discussion for another day, right? So
no, you're spot on. I actually put up I was actually talking about this in my podcast that I was recording the other day. Cancer is a whole nother animal. Cancer has a lot of really interesting insights, and there's a lot of experts who are way, way smarter than I am on that topic. But for me, the one thing that really struck a chord with me, and one of the reasons why I started diving down deeper into like the cancer realm, is I remember my uncle had just gone in for his first round of chemo and radiation, and he came out and he was like beat up, and he like literally fought the battle of his life to go through that treatment. And like within 5 minutes of him coming out, there was a nurse walking around with chips, soda, and crackers on a cart. And I looked at her and I like, it's not her fault. I'm like, this girl doesn't know. Like she really doesn't know. And my uncle was literally about to grab a soda, and I'm like, you're literally about to feed the very thing that you were just battling to kill. And that's the scary part. Like they don't know. And there's plenty of data now showing that glucose feeds cancer cells. And then all of a sudden you just went through this chemo to try and destroy them. And then next thing you turn around, you're feeding them.
Right.
So that's the scary piece.
Yeah, that's so unfortunate. I think this might've been on your podcast. I forgot where I heard it, but at MD Anderson, one of the things, which is a cancer institute in Houston, where it's part of the Texas Medical Center, the largest one in the nation. And one of the things that they do there is before they actually go into the cancer therapy, and I forget if it's a specific kind of cancer therapy or what, but they actually make their patients fast before they do their chemo. And that's just really fascinating to me because, I mean, why are you doing that? Is you're doing that because you're trying to take away the glucose sensitivity, take away cells that are growing and have them be able to, die if they need to. The cancer cells are, they have all this, if they have all the energy they need from this glucose, they're just going to keep growing. But, if you take it out, then you have a better chance of surviving. Yeah, you might lose some healthy cells along the way, but you're going to do it anyway through chemo. But, you're going to be better off. And so, yes, I can't, as you're talking about that story with your uncle, like, that's one of the most frustrating things is, we go to a hospital and, they finish, it doesn't even have to be cancer therapy. Just finish, someone that, is diabetic and is overweight, they go through a surgery and, because of the symptoms of being overweight, they have some kind of cardiovascular issue. They go through a surgery, and then they feed them the same thing right after. Coke and a burger, and that stuff. Just as someone going into medicine, that sometimes I wonder if I'm more fascinated by the nutrition aspects of medicine or just medicine itself. But man, that drives me insane. So I'm with you there, Ryan.
100% agreed. And I love that MD Anderson does that. There's data literally showing, to your point, that fasting before some of those treatments sensitizes your cells to respond better to that treatment. So I love that. I love that you brought that up.
So maybe this is a good segue for us to transition into something I'm really fascinated by, and that's your work, and not just your work on keto, but you just have so many things going on. I go to your Instagram, and you're traveling all the time. You're at conferences. You're publishing research. You're leading ASPI. You have your own podcast on top of all this. You're kind of doing it all. So when someone says, what do you do? What do you tell them?
That's a great question. Honestly, I just say I'm surround myself with great people that are helping me effectively try and do the best to change people's lives. And we do that through ASPI, really with our research and our science. We do that through ketogenic.com with the education and information we put out on there. And then I try and do it through the podcast, traveling around the world, speaking at engagements, not only talking about keto itself, but ultimately the lifestyle. And for me, the lifestyle piece is like perspective, really bringing in mindset, physical activity. How do you make this something that's beyond just what I put on my plate, but also what I feed my brain, like literally from news, information, resources, and perspective in general.
Yeah. So one thing that I think is very unique about the story that of your story is that you've actually, you started publishing research, and the research, was this is a space where not a ton of people are in it, right? I mean, now you have you, Dr. Dom, Peter Tia, and all these. I hear of all these people now, but 5 years ago that wasn't the case, and so you were on this great cusp of research. And you didn't, but the thing with you is you didn't just do the research and stop. You actually really went to the next level and tried to get this into the hands of people. And you started, all these different things. So can you kind of, talk a little bit more about that? So what does that look like for you? Why did you start these businesses? And I remember you describing that as, one of the most difficult things you did. So why did you do it, and how did it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, really, and no one's ever asked me that before, so I like this. So we were in academia. We were in academics for several years, and academics is great, but it also has barriers. And for me, a lot of the barriers comes in the publishing research realm, and people are starting to see a lot more of that, but they don't really see what goes on behind the scenes. But it really struck home with me when I was a sophomore. We did that first study. We went to go publish it, and in the publishing world, one of the things that people don't understand is that when you publish and you submit to a journal, now there's a crazy amount of journals. You could probably pay $50 and get something published. which is just crazy. So it just got out of hand. But back then, it was like if you wanted to get it into a good journal, say you submit it to the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research or some other journal, and you submit it, well, they have to then review it. Then they send it to people who are external reviewers, and they're just like colleagues. I was an external reviewer for many journals. Like, they're just people in the field. And it's on their, they're not getting paid for it or anything like that. So it's like on their time. So imagine someone who's extremely busy. Imagine like a Peter or Tia or Dom. And all of a sudden someone sends them a paper to review. Well, they have a million things going on. It might take them 3 months to get back reviews on that paper. Sometimes it might take them a year. And now imagine when you have 3 or 4 reviewers doing the same thing. So we finished and submitted that first paper our sophomore year. It didn't get published till I was about to graduate my senior year. And for me, that was just unacceptable. Like, I was like, this information, this is the reason why we're so far behind in science, is because there's not enough people, like, and they're always like, oh, you can't talk about it until it's published. I'm like, screw that. Like, why don't we go out and, like, there's all this stuff. Like, publishing is great. Like that's an important piece. We still do it. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't get to the end person, what good is that research? Like you can have the best research in the world. If it doesn't effectively help, you can't translate it and effectively help change someone's life. What good is it? Why are you even doing research in the first place if that's not your end goal? And so we stepped out, we left academics, and literally we're like, we need to go out on our own and create Applied Science and Performance Institute, or ASPI, really with a goal of being able to do this research, translate it to the masses. And that's what we're constantly doing and constantly trying to innovate with, is how do we get this message out? How do we take what we're doing and make it so it's practical and applicable for people in the real world?
Yeah. So whenever you started all these things, you didn't have a business background. So, how did that process look like? What made it so difficult as you were starting? So you wrote a book, you started ASPI, you started ketogenic.com. You have so many different things going on. So, and one of the things that we talk about on this show is the hardest part to doing something is actually just starting it. Yep. So, once you got through that barrier, what was so difficult about it?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, like you said, the hardest part's getting started. Like, it was like, wow, we're taking this leap, and for that leap, it's basically like, I've seen the analogy where people are like, it's like jumping out of a plane and figuring out how to build a parachute on the way down. And to me, like, that's some of the best decisions I've ever made. Looking back, it's the most difficult. Or during the time, it's the most difficult. Looking back, it's the best decision we made, because ultimately that's what forces people to change. I think sometimes, including myself, there's been points in my life where I've gotten comfortable, and you get comfortable and you're like, well, I don't know if I want to do that. Like, it's going to be a lot, like it's going to be a lot to undertake. And then, but the best way to do it is like having someone just like be like, cool, push you off. And now you're like, wow, now I have no choice. Like, I literally have no choice but to do this. And that's what it became for Jacob and I, is we have no choice but to make this successful. And from there, it just compounded. And one of the things we've always had a centerpiece, it's been a center core of what we do, is you need to have the right team. You need to have the right people around you, or else you can't build everything on your own. You can't. It doesn't matter how good you are. You need to build the right people around you who have the same vision. Like, I've turned down people. We've had so many people that have come with incredible resumes, but they just have like a different vision, or their mission's different. And I'm like, you're incredible, but at the end of the day, like, you need to see what we're trying to do here so we can build it together. Like, I'm not trying to be like, oh, let's build things for me. It's no, this is all of us. And that's something I tell my team constantly, is like, we're building what we're building together. Like, I want to look back one day and all of us be sitting on somewhere on a getaway, and we're looking back and our kids are now working for the same company, and we're like, this is amazing. Look at what we built. Like, look at the legacy we were able to leave. And we keep that very near and dear to our heart. So our team's very close. We're like family, and everyone buys into the vision to make it a lot easier.
Yeah, I think one thing that you said there is about building a team that it really resonated with me and actually reminded me is, I'm reminded about the story of Instagram. So the founder of Instagram went to Peter Thiel and said, hey, I have this idea for Instagram. What do you, would you invest? And he said, yes, but go find someone else that's going to help you out. And it just shows that the power of people and how, you could do it on your own, but you're going to do it better with someone else. And just having that team around you is going to make you a better person. So I love that. I'd love to, hear about how you kind of tackle all this personally, right? And I think the way I look at my life is, the day starts in the morning. And so that's why I'm so obsessed with morning routines. And so what does your morning routine look like?
I'm the complete same way. I'm a big proponent of, if you win the morning, you can win the day. And for me, my morning routine is it's very, very structured to some degree. I do the same thing. I wake up at 5 o'clock. The first thing I do is I use an app called Elevate. It's kind of like Luminosity, I guess, but like for our demographic. But it's a game. It's like a gaming thing where like it just gets my brain going. And I go through and I do Elevate. Kind of, it's like math and memory and all that fun stuff. Then right now I actually am doing another app called Duolingo, which I'm trying to learn Spanish. So I'm going through lessons in Spanish, and that's literally while I'm still in bed, snuggled. Scoot, my dog, is usually snuggled next to me. And then the first thing I do is, as soon as I get up, I go right over to my desk and I start with my gratitude journal. And for me, that's like my state. That's like, cool. Day is really starting. Like the first two are to wake my brain up, like get things going. Now I hit my gratitude journal and it's game on. And so then I do gratitude journal. I usually knock out, I don't even open up my emails till I get into the office, but I usually knock out anything that I didn't finish from the night before that I need to. Then I take my dog for a nice long walk, come back, hit the gym, and then it's immediately into the office.
Yeah. So whenever you're talking about your gratitude journal, I think that's huge, right? Because we can go through our day, but we kind of forget our why and we forget the things that we've been blessed with. And so is that like you writing down a few things that you are thankful for, or is that like you just kind of writing maybe a paragraph or two? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I actually have a journal I write in, and it's basically 3 things every morning that I'm grateful for. And they're things, and they change. Like a lot of times people are like, well, how do you think of that every day? Well, like for me, like this morning, one of my things was like, I'm grateful to have running water, because someone messaged me on Instagram and was like sending me pictures of like where they live and they don't have running water. And I was like, we take that for granted. The fact that like I can go shower and this person can't. So little things like that. And for me, that really anchors things in. And then I have an I am statement. So I write down like an I am, and it's empowering. Like, what am I? Like, I am a great leader, blah, 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 whatever you want to put in. And then 2 or 3 things that you want to accomplish for the day. Like if I come home at the end of the day, what will I be extremely happy about to go? If everything else goes to crap, I at least accomplished these 2 or 3 things, because I think a lot of times people lose sight of that and they get overwhelmed with task. And then they come home and they're just paralysis by analysis. They come home and they're just frustrated and unfulfilled because they didn't really get anything done. Like they got a little bit done of several things, but they never accomplished anything. And so for me, I try and come home and go, I start the day with, these are things I'm grateful for. These are things I want to accomplish. And then when I come home at night, I go back into that journal and go, what are some things that I did well? What are the things that I accomplished? And what are some things maybe tomorrow I can get better at?
Where'd you find this journal by chance?
It's the one that I use is called, there's a bunch that are out there, but the one I use is called the 5-Minute Journal. I literally just got it, I think, on Amazon.
Are you a fan of Tim Ferriss by chance?
Yes.
Okay, because the 5-Minute Journal does sound all too familiar. So for those that don't know, Tim Ferriss is kind of a life hack guru, and so one of his listeners ended up reading that, and what he started was the journal, and I think that's so neat because Tim actually uses that now. But yeah, it just sounded familiar, so I had to ask. And do you meditate by chance, Ryan?
I do. I try and incorporate in at least 3 times per week. It needs to be more prioritized in everything that I do. I want to make it a weekly thing, but I do like a guided one through Muse. I use like the Muse thing, but it's an absolute essential piece of my day, or else I'd be probably stress levels over 1,000 if I didn't do it.
Yeah. I'm the same way. There's a difference between the time the day when I meditate and the day when I don't. It's almost like I have to for me. So whenever you have your day, I'm sure you have like a bazillion things that happen. You have guys like me messaging you on Instagram to get on a podcast, and you got people that are asking you to come to conferences, and I'm sure the list just goes on and on. How do you structure your day so that you don't get distracted by all the extra noise that's out there?
Great point. And you can easily get distracted by a lot of that noise. So one of the things I do is I literally chunk my day into work blocks. And then I also chunk my day into times when, in essence, my team is accessible to me. And they know they're accessible to me at any time. Like it could be midnight and I'll find a way. But my goal is like otherwise when you're at the office, you'll hear like the knock on the door every 5 seconds. And what people don't realize, Mel Robbins actually talks about this. People always go, hey, do you have a quick second? And I always say, like, I used to just always be like, yes, yes, yes. But now I say no, because it's not a quick second. It's actually 30 minutes. So like research has shown like, hey, when you're working time on task, and then all of a sudden someone comes in and says, hey, do you have a quick second? You take time off task. Now you're focusing on their question. It takes you about 30 minutes to get back into the zone to be on the tasks that you were on. So I try and be very, very mindful of that. And I try and tell my team to be very mindful of that. Of like, if I have 3 chunks, like if I have like an hour and a half chunk where I'm like, cool, I do this in this hour and a half, this hour and a half, I'll set aside time in between those chunks where we can go on a walk, we can go do whatever, I can answer questions, but don't come all the time knocking on my door when I could do that, or send me an email. So I try and be very, very mindful of being fully present, fully engaged, because I think a lot of times people feel like they work 80 hours when in actuality they could, if they were just mindful of the time and the effort they put into something specific, they could probably knock out that 80 hours in 30 hours. It's just that they are doing something and then all of a sudden they get an email, they get distracted, or they get a Facebook message or they see their Instagram light up and now they go to Instagram. All these different things add up and people often lose sight of that.
Yeah, I think the real sense of power comes from being present in the moment. And I think you could already tell, like, I think meditation really helps with that. But I think the second thing you mentioned about being blocking off chunks of your day and just focusing on work, that's something that was actually mentioned by one of our second guests, Danny Huizinga, who's a consultant at Accenture, and he does a lot of other nonprofit work and writes. And he's one of the busiest guys I know. And that's what he says is I have to block off time and just focus and be in the moment. And if not, then it's not going to happen. So I think that's huge. So one other thing I wanted to touch up on is the Pareto's Principle, the 80-20 principle, if no one has heard of this. And just to give a introduction to the 80-20 principle, it's just this concept that was invented or talked about by Pareto a long time ago. And it was basically about you take 20% of input and that ends up leading to 80% of output. So, take, for example, 20% of the American population owns 80% of the wealth, but this could apply to other things as well. So like 20% of the time that you put into something actually leads to 80% of the entire output. One of the things that I heard from you is that you take the 20%, which is the most, the most that you're getting out of this input. And of the 20%, you try to focus on the top 4%. And you said that that's what drives the growth in anything that we do. And I just thought that was so fascinating. So what does that look like in your own life?
Yeah, so that's something I actually learned from Tony Robbins. So we work with Tony very closely, and he it was something that came across either at one of his events or something we were talking with him at, and he basically said the 80-20 rule is great, but what if you took 80% of that 20% and you come up with 4% left, and that 4% really drives like 60%, and you really look at it and you're like, wow, that's really intriguing. Like, people often get lost because they're like, oh, well, the 20% is big. Well, what if you just really hyper focused on the 4%? And that's something we started doing more and more. I just actually had a deep dive with my team at Ketogenic, and we're in the process of doing it with ASPE, of like really narrowing down, like, hey, who is your target market? Like, who are people that you're really trying to effectively reach? Because everyone, it doesn't matter who you are, always thinks like, oh, well, I want this to apply to everyone. Like you always have that kind of feeling of like, well, everyone can get this. You're like, cool. Well, let them stick on. Let them be a sticky thing that comes on the side. But that's not who your tunnel focus on. Like, focus on that top 4%. Focus on those top 4 priorities. Focus on those top 4 objectives of what you're trying to accomplish. Because there's a million things that will always present themselves. But that 4% is really what's going to drive your growth and allow you then to expand out from there. So those are always things we kind of keep in context with everything that we're doing, is like the 4% of people for ASPE, like the 4% of that we're trying to target with the training that we're trying to accomplish. Like we narrow it down and go, these are the types of people we should be catering to, versus trying to go like for our training side, rather than go like a gym, LA Fitness, 24-hour fitness. Those aren't the people we're looking for. We're looking for more of the people like Tony Robbins. Those are our type of client. So that's just really how we narrow it down and focus it.
Yeah, what you're talking about is actually very unconventional to traditional business or things that people teach in business school. But I think it's, I think it's so simple, right? Like, why would I want to focus on this entire group if I could nail 100% of this smaller subset? And I think that there's so much power in that. So as you're working with Tony, Ryan, what is something that really stands out to you about him? What's something that you've been able to pick up and apply in your own life?
Honestly, he's one of the biggest people that it's actually going to be my next tattoo, is be here now, like be present. He's one of the biggest people. It doesn't matter how busy he is. Like he's probably, like you said, one of the busiest people in the entire world, because he has so many things that are going on. But when he's with you, like he's with you. Like he's not one of those people who's going to be like, hey, let me talk to you, and then he's texting on his phone, answering emails, answering a call while he's talking to you. Like he's with you. Like it is full present engagement. And for me, that's been an absolute game changer. It's something that's changed the way I deal with my life, changed the way I approach things. I talk about this all the time. I actually learned, Ben Greenfield does this as well with his kids. I kind of have a kid. He's my dog, but he's my pet kid. But honestly, I've done this before, and I'm making a habit of it now, because it's going to be the exact same way for when I have actual human kids. But it doesn't matter if I'm driving home. It doesn't matter if I get inside of my garage. I will not go inside of my house unless I am fully present and ready for my dog to look at me all excited, because like a lot of times people go in and they'll be inside their house and they'll walk in on their phone, or they'll walk in texting, they'll just drop their bag and they'll go into their office. I never want to be like that. Like I know he has been waiting all day, as crazy as it sounds, like he has been waiting all day long for me to come home, and it would just be a smack in his face, and it wouldn't be fair for me to walk in distracted and upset or angry or anything other than excited to see him. And so I've sat in my garage for literally like an hour before finishing up a call, waiting to go inside to make sure that I'm fully present and fully engaged the minute I walk in.
Oh, I love every bit of that. That's awesome. Ryan, so let's move on to maybe a fun part of the segment. It's called the hot seat, and it's basically just some random questions that I have that are probably not some of the ones that I've been that are part of the conversations that we've been having so far. And so I have 4 questions for you today. So the first one is, I know you're a big wine person. So what's your go-to wine?
Oh, Duckhorn Cab. I love Duckhorn Cabernets. I'm a big red wine fan, but Duckhorn's one of my favorite wineries in Napa Valley.
Does that kick you out of ketosis?
It doesn't. Red wine, I mean, stick with the dry. It's a dry red. If I were to probably have the entire bottle, I'd be more than kicked out of ketosis. But a glass every now and then is completely fine.
I'll check that out. The problem with me is I'm not a big fan of dry wine. So, yeah, so that's the problem. But, I might just start having to get into it. But maybe that'll become an acquired taste.
We'll go to a winery. We'll fix your palate.
So what's a book that you think every young adult should read?
How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's the number one thing I tell my team. It's the number one thing I recommend to anyone. people hear the word influence people and they're like, well, wow, that sounds aggressive. It has nothing to do with as long as you're using it for the right reasons. It's about relationships. It's about focusing on how to have conversations, and for everyone, I think it can be applied.
Yeah, Dale Carnegie is just he's a legend, and that's a timeless piece for sure. What's a favorite place that you've traveled to?
Ooh, tough. It'd have to be between Brazil and Chile. China is great. I haven't really got to experience China yet, but Brazil and Chile just got to feel like the culture, the great food. It's just really, really cool to see people be so receptive, so warm, and then how they go about their lives. I love learning about that stuff. So, and the best way to learn is like be fully in it. So it's pretty cool to see that.
And the last one I have for you on the hot seat is what's the best purchase you made under $50?
Oh, wow. That's a really, really good question. Actually, I mean, it would be my dog. So
Wow.
I adopted him. Adopted him, and the fees were definitely under $50. But he literally has changed my entire perspective on life. So he's a tripod. So he comes from an abusive household. He somehow broke his arm. They had to amputate it, and so I got him after the amputation. And he is fearless, like absolutely fearless. And from someone who has gone through probably more trauma than I even want to think about, he is the most loving and caring. And it doesn't matter what color you are, what your sexuality is, if you're big, overweight, nothing, he loves everyone the same. And like, for me, I like, people don't think you learn a lot. Like, I learn a ton from him and his interaction and his excitement to be active. He does not let the fact that he has 3 legs hold him down. Like, he's been an absolute game changer in my life.
Wow. I love that. Yeah. So Ryan, I want to make sure I leave time to touch up on something that I know you're really passionate about, and that's your mission. And you described that as to make positivity louder. Yeah. So what does that look like for you? What does that mean? And I'll just kind of let you run with it.
Yeah. So for me, this really started back when I was in high school. And so I had family members and friends who were plagued just by negative stuff. And the more and more I realized that, like, the things you surround yourself with, right? That cliche thing of like, oh, the 5 people you hang around, like, that's real. Like, that stuff is actually real. And when you surround yourself with negativity, it tends to overwhelm you. And the more I started seeing, like, my mom would wake up, she'd turn on the news, and like, nothing on the news is ever good news. Like, it's always like, this person's killed, this person got in an accident, this political craziness, like, whatever it is, it's always like negative, because that's what draws people's attention. I was like, screw this. Like, there's so many amazing things that are going on in the world. There's so many exciting things. Why not make that louder? Like, I think like, for me, it was an ultimate mindset and shift to go, how do we make this message louder? How do we make positivity louder? Because I think so many people lose perspective. And at the core of it, that's really what it's all about, is bringing perspective to people to understand, listen, at the end of the day, like, you're complaining because someone cut you off in your car or you spilled coffee inside of your car. Be grateful that you have that coffee. Like, switch your mindset and say, you're driving a car. There's probably 3/4 of the world who don't have the funds to afford a car. Like, for me, that's the perspective change. And the minute you can start seeing things from all these different perspectives of like, wow, like, it's really a small thing in the grand scheme of things, you switch your mindset to really start seeing the good in the world and start seeing everything positive that's going on and go, wow, how do I make this more of an example? How do I try to radiate this more? Because I think it can help more and more people. And that's ultimately my goal. If I can help shift people's perspective and make them see the good in every situation, like, it's not always going to be fine and dandy and full of flowers, but it's all about learning perspective. And I think the minute you learn perspective is the minute you can shift that mindset to a positive one. And that's ultimately the goal of making positivity louder.
Yeah, that's awesome, Ryan. I'm just so taken away by all that you've done, not, professionally through your work, but also just, when I hear your podcast, I can kind of tell the kind of person you are. And I love that balance. Well, Ryan, if someone wants to learn more about keto or learn more about your work or stay connected with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, for information on keto, definitely go to ketogenic.com. That's our website resource. Me personally, I'm on Instagram at Ryan P. Lowery. People always make fun of it because they say Ryan Plowry, but Patrick is my middle name, so it's at Ryan P. Lowery. On Facebook and YouTube, it's Dr. Ryan Lowery. So I usually answer or try and respond as quickly as possible to any messages, just to try and help out as much as I can.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And I know that some people are going to look into keto because of this. I know some people are just going to, I think some people are just going to understand what it means to live a better lifestyle because of you. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, brother. I really appreciate it.
If you like what you heard on the Yash and Company podcast, go ahead and subscribe to stay up to date on all things Yash and Company. If you check out our website at yashandco.com, we'll actually mail you a free sticker if you subscribe. But until next Wednesday, ladies and gentlemen, this is Yash signing out.